expert Igor Koliushko, who will join us, and now I invite here Shevchenko, Yulia Drogovoz, and Maksym Latsyba. Welcome, colleagues. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We will start. The main engine of the reforms is the parliament, and the parliament has to adopt laws and launch reforms. So the rehabilitation package of reforms initiates the launch of the platform of reforms, whose task is to unite public experts and MPs that will suggest dynamics and will launch the reforms. We will become a starter of reforms. Yesterday, the first sitting of the initiative group took place. There were 10 MPs delegated by 5 democratic factions who plan to create a coalition in the parliament. We have, of course, approved of this, and we think that during the second plenary week of the parliament, its creation will be made public. So we call upon every MP to join this platform. Our main task is to unite the efforts of MPs and public in order to push for reforms, in order for the parliament to be open and transparent and to hear the voice of public. And one of the first initiatives of this platform will be the opening of the work of the parliament for the citizens. So just like in European parliaments, the citizens may come and watch how our MPs are working. We also agreed that the RPR will today send to every political force proposals on coalition agreement. Yesterday we met the bloc of Petro Poroshenko, and very soon we have to meet other democratic factions. We have a number of proposals and amendments. What's on the surface, as you've seen, of course, is that there are no mentions of human rights or civil society in both drafts of the coalition agreement. However, this has to be what the Ukrainian state exists for. And of course, more detailed, Igor Koliushko, who will join us a bit later, will dwell upon our proposals. And now I give the floor to my colleague Taras Shevchenko. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. From myself, I want to add several words, and again, of course, from the rehabilitation package of reforms. We're very glad that this time the process of signing the coalition agreement is happening in a sufficiently open way when the drafts are published, and everyone who wants to take part have an opportunity to offer their proposals and try to convince politicians at this stage that the reforms that are not in the document so far are important and have to make their way to the document. We think that Ukraine should move along the right lines of formation of the government, where everything starts not from the division, not from the distribution of positions, but from the reforms, not to be likened by West or East or citizens. The coalition agreement has to be a clear-cut plan of action plan, and then we and you journalists have to watch to which extent they adhere to this action plan. And we are sure that at this stage it is very important that priorities are included into those coalition laws. Coalition agreement, even before the elections, the rehabilitation package of reforms has prepared a roadmap of reforms, priorities, for instance, in the segment of public administration. This is available on our site, and with this we came for negotiations with politicians even before the in the elections. On the 18th of October, we held a huge forum where we got a preliminary agreement from politicians that they will adhere to this plan. So for us, it is important to provide for the inclusion of some reforms. For this, they agreed that they make it to the coalition agreement. Yesterday, Koliushko started to talk about the law on elections, but the question number one for him was, excuse us, but this is not in your coalition agreement draft. We think that the law on local elections and the law on parliamentary elections should be adopted first of all. Europeans do not always understand why we need the law on parliamentary elections if we have just held the elections. But we think that this is the moment where you can push and press and provide for open lists elections. Of course, we have to talk about different models, but we think that, first of all, this should be included into the coalition agreement and then work on this. Local elections that have to happen in a year has to happen again in a new way. For instance, the election of the law of mayors in 2 rounds, because at the moment a mayor can get only 17%, for instance, of support, while the attendance was 50%, which means that in reality this person is supported by something like 8% of local population. This is not an optimum model. I cannot talk about all our proposals at the press conference. The amendments to the constitution, more clarity on the court system. There's no media part, and Maksym told you that there's no civil society. There are no changes as far as media is concerned, and our priority there is the introduction of real public broadcasting. There's a lot of other things, but if there are questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
We know that one of the key reforms, which is one of the most important ones, is the tax reform. We see that within 2014 means that the payment capacity of the population has decreased, the GDP has fallen and will be falling, and we expect it to go down by 10%, and that is the result of non-efficient economic policy which has been conducted till today, and reforms in, especially in tax sphere, are necessary. We see that in coalition agreement there are certain directions of tax reforms but they reflect the draft laws 59-58, which was proposed by the government. In this case, we repeat the mistakes of our government, and this way, business will be faced with further non-efficient operation of companies. The financial situation of these companies will be deteriorating, and we need to change the whole philosophy of the tax system. What we see in the coalition agreement, these are the reforms which were proposed by the government, and they were criticized by experts. The reform itself is directed not towards improvement of indicators, not to improve to have economic growth, but it's directed towards fiscal pressure, towards populism. And not just fiscal pressure, but it also allows corruption to grow and allows persecution of citizens to take place, because there are some non-direct methods of control, and that means that certain methods could be used against any citizen. And any citizen can be persecuted by fiscal bodies. The concept itself, which is included into the governmental reform and coalition agreement, was criticized. The business would not agree, and but somehow all these comments were not taken into account. I will give you some examples. The provision about accounting standards which are according to international and Ukrainian standards, and business cannot make any adjustments. One of the adjustments is transfer of losses. If this is not done, the business will be paying the income tax without taking into account the amounts of the previous period. We were against that in the past, and I can draw your attention that this is something we cannot accept. Equal conditions are needed. We need to leave the adjustments which are necessary. Even though we need to introduce all these accounting standards, both for small and large businesses. What reanimation package of reforms proposes is taxation not at the moment when income is accrued, but when the profit of the company is distributed, when the dividends are paid, or when other payments are made which are equal to dividends. Only then these sums can be taxed, and this will take into account losses. Also, the reduction, the issue of reducing the pressure on the salaries fund. It is important to get additional source to reduce the rates, and also it is important to legalize shadow incomes, but not under the pressure, not under some fiscal pressure, but voluntarily. We need to help voluntary legalization, and this could be done only if the burden on the salary fund is decreased, and we have not seen any reaction to that. The rate which is suggested in coalition agreement, that is the system which was proposed by the government, but this is integrated, and the results will be the same. So we insist that reforms which our government plans to implement, they should correspond to the requirements of business. They should be directed towards economic growth. And for that, we submitted our proposals, and we hope that our proposals will be heard and will be taken into account. Any questions?
I have a question. For instance, to Maksym and Taras, how do you think, is there a need to include into the coalition agreement such principled issues as the removal of MPs' immunity? This was one of the demands of the Maidan, and I think that this can be included, and it's worth including, but we have to understand what the removal of immunity means. Every European Parliament has parliamentary immunity, but the question is the volume. If there's a criminal offense committed by the MP, then he is not immune. This person is arrested, and I think that Ukrainian MPs have to have some immunity. The task of the aim of the immunity is to lessen the pressure on an MP from law enforcers that can pressurize the parliament and manipulate. So the matter is about the volume. Our MPs are the most untouchable among all the European MPs. Of course, we have to provide for direct prosecution during because of serious crimes, but as you know, if the Prosecutor General demands, then the Parliament can remove this immunity. Although I do think that the coalition agreement has to have a clause on the limitation of the immunity. Yes, we have such a proposal, and today we are sending our demands as far as the coalition agreement is concerned, and at least with the Poroshenko bloc, we have a promise that they will consider them on Monday and will send out on Tuesday their edited proposals. I hope that very soon we will be able to meet Front Zmin, Batkivshina and Samopomich and talk to them. Any other questions? How do you think, among all the proposals that your organization prepares for the coalition agreement, what are the hardest to include? The hardest to be is going to be to include everything that we submit. I was surprised, and Taras has mentioned this already, there are no mentions about electoral reform in the drafts of coalition agreement. We all see the after effects of this first past the post constituencies, and they create a potential for MPs to switch coalitions and a great number of violations. For us experts, and I think for journalists as well, it is evident that this should be one of the priority reforms, and we will insist on creation of a parliamentary group that will be developing a new edition of the new version of the law on elections of local councillors and MPs, and public experts should be included into this group. We will similarly insist on the creation of a parliamentary constitutional commission. We feel that big, great politicians have already a great desire to change the constitution, and from the previous experience we know that this is a desire to change the constitution in their own offices, and we insist on the creation of an open constitutional parliamentary commission where Ukrainian scientists and law experts will be included so that the public and journalists see how the new social treaty is being formed, and we insist on this to be included into the coalition agreement. Let's do it together, because we all need this. And now I give the floor to Mr. Igor Koliushko. Hello, everybody. Sorry for being late. We've got some communicational breakdown. I didn't know that I had to be here, but still I came here. Yes, the issue that we are talking about now is very important. We have held the parliamentary elections in the country, and as soon as the new convocation of the parliament convenes, the government has to lay down the authority, and the first thing that the parliament has to do is to form the government, just as in any democratic country, so that there's no vacuum of power. And of course, everybody understands that when they are acting ministers and acting government, this is a transitional situation. Yesterday, we've met representatives. I mean the meeting with representatives from Brussels. Very important people whom I can't name now. They decide the policy of EU towards Ukraine. Yesterday I was impressed how they, in a rising intonation, said, listen, if you organize the Koalishada, Premieriada, Speakeriada, There are so many people in Europe to use this fact and stop any support to Ukraine. We cannot guarantee anything. If you want an outside support, if you want to move towards development, you have to very fastly and very qualitatively form the new government. Understanding this situation, we in the rehabilitation package of reform have drawn an address to the president and leaders of political parties who have formed factions in the parliament about the formation of the forming of the government of Ukraine. I know it's been handed out, so we are drawing their attention to the fact that while forming the government, the politicians have to proceed from the desire to have the government that is implementing reforms. So the ministers' positions should be occupied by people who will become leaders of reform, and this should be the main criterion when selecting people for ministership. To conduct reforms without the participation of ministers is impossible. Even in previous years, when Yanukovych seemed to concentrate the entire power in his hands, and the majority in the parliament and the government, he tried to develop and conduct reforms from the administration of the president, and he failed in many directions, because to conduct reforms above the head of ministers, from above the heads of ministries, no one was able to do this. How shall we proceed to realize this task? First of all, today, in a time when the newly elected MPs are preparing to take their oath of allegiance and enter their positions of MPs, they all have to prepare their proposals about coalition agreement. If they intend to participate. I don't know whether this concerns every faction. I always remember that it's good that one of the factions has said that they do not want power and call themselves opposition bloc. It's understood that at least one faction is not participating in this, but all the rest will probably want to take part. Maybe no, I don't know. But those who want to do this are obliged to prepare proposals on coalition agreement. What is coalition agreement? This is a document to be signed between factions, and it has to carry the answer to at least three questions. First, how the coalition is formed, coalition of factions in the parliament, how it will be managed, how it will organize its work, how it will pass decisions, how will it interact with the government, with the president, everything that concerns the work of factions of the government majority in the parliament. The second block of issues, how they form the government. And it is very important not just to confirm the list of positions. However, our recommendation is that the number of ministries has to go down in our government, and not to inflate the number of vice prime ministers, as they often do this when they seek the opportunity to give positions to everyone who wants. But this is not enough. In this block of the coalition agreement, you should put down that the government that has to conduct reforms has to work in a new way from the very first day, not waiting for instructions from above, as our officials are used to, just to perform the instructions that they have from the prime minister. They have to organize the process of analysis of policy and the preparation of government decisions from beneath, so that the prime minister and ministers manage to select from the proposals that are coming to them what they are doing today, what they are doing tomorrow. Otherwise, the government won't be successful.
And the third block of coalition agreement is directions of reforms about which the factions come to an agreement. this should not cover the whole spectrum of politics. They have to agree on where their views coincide. They have to take commitments and execute what is in the coalition agreement. There may be many ideas beyond the agreement which will be later finalized, but what they agree on should be fixed in the coalition agreement. And one more thing I would like to say, very often people argue. Sometimes some of our politicians publicly say, what can we do? All over the world, the government is formed on the basis of party quotas, but they forget that party quotas are applied after there are proposals made as to qualify the people for all ministerial positions submitted by all the parties which are part of a governmental coalition. But what's happening here, without looking at the names, without looking at which faction has experienced people, they first try to distribute the portfolios, and then they say, okay, that's our portfolio and we will give it to whoever we want. And these are the approaches which are destructive for the government. But first they have to agree on the prime minister, and then the prime minister will see who are experienced, trained, prepared executors, and consulting with the leaders of the factions. Of course, all the factions are to be presented, but they have to select based on the criteria whether the person is ready to become the leader in a sector. And these are the messages which we address from the RPR to politicians who won at the parliamentary elections, and we do hope that they will do this part of work. We have time for one more question. When do you expect to get answers? Monday or when? As to the package of your reforms, as to your proposals, and how will you be controlling it? What are the chances that all these reforms will be introduced into the agreement? As Maksym mentioned, on Monday we expect that Petro Poroshenko bloc will submit the updated version, but the procedure will not end up here. The process will continue, and at any stage when there are new versions, we will look at whether our initiatives were taken into account. So the way how to control this is to look at the updated versions. The time, it depends not on us but on politicians, how quickly they will come to an agreement. But the updated version we expect to get on Monday, and the first results we'll be able to assess then. And I would like to call upon journalists. When you see the leaders of the faction, ask, what are your candidates for the positions of the Ministry of the Interior, the Minister of Justice, all the ministers? That is your task, to stimulate public policy, to teach our political leaders how to publicly submit candidates, because theoretically we need to have 5 candidates for the position of the Minister of the Interior from 5 factions, and we have to provide comments on whether these people are professionally ready and whether they are ready to become leaders of the reforms in militia, for example. And let's, at each meeting, ask Poroshenko, Lutsenko, Yatsenyuk, what are their candidates for 16 ministries which we have in the government. And this way we will stimulate transparent policy. Also, the Crisis Media Center, you can invite them here. You will have the press briefing here at 3 o'clock, and ask, please, Petro Poroshenko bloc, Народный front, please give us all your candidates for all the 16 positions. Thank you. Today at 3 o'clock, we will have the newly elected representatives from different political forces, and they will be talking about their proposals on coalition agreement, and we'll ask them these questions. Thank you. And we will have a round table on the reform